Hi, my name's Phil, and I like to talk about politics. And the winner of the poll today, well, it's asked us to go all Scottish today. No, not to talk about their recent away performances from the football team, although at least the rugby team put some fire in the belly. No, this is about Scottish independence and particular implications of Brexit on Scottish independence. Now, on this issue, polls have indicated a number of twists and turns in what is and always has really been a fairly balanced issue. My own feeling is that no country has ever become wealthier or more powerful by dividing. Some countries have divided, or divorced if you will, from unreconcilable political differences for a variety of reasons. Most closely, of course, the independence of much of Ireland, for example. And that it can work out well for a population. After all, you don't have to be a powerful or a wealthy nation to be happy. Scandinavian countries, for example, have modest economies and limited international influence, but their populations feature highly on the happiness index, and it's because their countries are run according to their wishes. They meet with the general approval. And, the same was true in the Republic of Ireland as it is now, for example. It's not wealthy. It was extremely vulnerable to the global crash of a decade ago. It suffered very badly. Thank goodness it was part of the EU, eh? But the distribution of what wealth they do have is better during the good times. This is why, although the wealth of the Republic of Ireland is much less than the UK, which is why it was less able to weather the global financial storm, its GDP per capita is way higher. So they get all the benefits of a high production per capita with that partial safety net, which comes with being in the EU, against the problems of a small overall economy. Now, the average salary, for example, of a citizen of the Republic of Ireland is well above that for a citizen of Northern Ireland. So how would an independent Scotland fare? Well, if we assume that its economy remains much as it is now, which is a big assumption really, as difficulties with trade with its nearest neighbour would cause the same level of problems as the UK is going to find itself if we actually do go for a hard Brexit. But let's just say for the sake of argument. So it would still be less than the average of the rest of the UK. But if the independent Scottish Parliament, for example, implemented better distribution of wealth than the Westminster Parliaments and the Holyrood Parliaments currently do, then actually that could work out pretty well. And it would be possible. After all, Holyrood would no longer be able to blame a different body for their failings, and the people of a newly independent nation are hardly likely to allow any excuses if their standard of living doesn't at least go up. Otherwise, what would the upheaval be in aid of? But would Brexit tip the balance in favour of independence? Now, although I've poked holes before in the SNP arguing that Brexit is dumb because it's stupid to leave a union that is more powerful and wealthier than the individual state. But oh yes, we should leave a union that is more powerful and wealthier than the individual state. But it may nonetheless be seen as a choice between two unions if the UK leaves the EU. And even a Brexit, I suppose, with a deal that makes Scotland worse off, or at least where people convince them it's worse off, would still be grounds for that. Now, if we know one thing about British politics, it's that it doesn't really matter what is the best option because nobody listens to experts. What seems to matter is what the person that you are happy to listen to says about it. But as long as the people in Scotland are not at least lied to about the independence dividend in the same way as the UK as a whole was with the Brexit dividend, then at least people can know what they're voting for. Now, at the end of the day, this is about a distorted view of history. It hasn't been helped by poor distribution of wealth that we have in the UK, but that's not what it's all about. If that were the motivator, then people in the north of England, where I come from, would also be screaming for independence. No, it's about a border that hasn't actually meant a great deal for centuries. There's no such border between the north and south of England, for example, so that historical nonsense isn't at play. People often say that the people of England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland are all very different. We're not. We're all full of shit when it comes to these perceived notions of nationalism. It's impossible to describe the traits of being English without either excluding most people in England or including traits common to other parts of the British Isles. But people carry on as if these distinctions are real, as if people behave according to which side of an imaginary line they grew up on in what is essentially the same nation. We haven't helped ourselves either by having separate football, rugby and cricket teams when sport is usually such a powerful tool for uniting a nation. We also didn't help matters by devolving power in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but not England. That just reinforced the view that Westminster acts on behalf of England, when in reality it's just London. But perceptions, no matter how silly I might think them to be, are actually the most important when it comes to nationality. After all, nationality is ultimately about identity, and that isn't an objective fact. So it could well be that it works out for Scotland in terms of overall satisfaction. There would need to be work done. However, we've got to bear in mind a couple of things. Although Scotland is described as voting to remain in the EU, it was by a comfortable margin. Not a massive one. 38% still voted to leave the EU. Now, imagine that sort of person. What would they think to leaving the UK only to then rejoin the EU? There'd be a bit of strife. There's unlikely to be a large swing towards independence. That's simply not realistic. There may be a good chance of the next referendum returning a result of over 50% for independence if we do leave the EU, but it won't be by that much. So there would be a rift along those lines as well. Now, on a personal level, I always think it's disappointing when a country splits up because the whole is always greater than the sum of its parts. It would also represent losing another citizenship for me personally. You know, when I was born, I was a British and European citizen, as I still am at the moment. Now, it could well be that by the time I retire, I will not possess either citizenship. I don't even know what I'm going to be. For Scotland itself, I'd probably say that the main path to happiness with independence would be how the political system adapts. People have noted with Brexit how it lays bare the two-party system and how it lacks the flexibility to deal with political crises. But if there's one thing that's worse than a two-party system, it's a one-party system. And you can't ignore the lessons of other newly independent nations in this regard. So, following independence, it could go one of two ways, for example, with the SNP. Now, the party itself would likely be flying high after a split. After all, the other parties would have campaigned against it. I suppose if the vote is tight, as polls indicate it probably would be, then the Scottish Labour Party could just detach itself from the National Party and attract a lot of support there. Hey presto, you have at least a two-party system. Although if that two-party system ends up being very one-sided in terms of one side is happy to be independent and still campaigns for that, and the other side is wanting us to rejoin the UK later down the line, in the same way that many of us would fight to rejoin the EU if we left it, you end up with a right old political mess. In fact, what you basically end up with is Northern Ireland, where all the parties campaign on a single issue, which doesn't have anything to do with making people's lives better. The Scottish Liberal Democrats would also likely be there, I would think. The Conservatives probably needn't bother. But in the event that the SNP are securing their power for the foreseeable future, there then arises the risk of corruption. In a one-party system, when politicians don't fear for elections, they tend to feel themselves less accountable. There's also a stronger motivation to put up candidates from the party's point of view that are extremely loyal, and that is to say a bit thick and they toe the party line. Hopefully it wouldn't come to that either, but that is a serious danger. But there may be another possibility. Once they've achieved what they all joined the SNP for, they may find themselves disagreeing much more on certain issues. After all, although the SNP have a domestic agenda to pursue in the devolved Scottish Parliament, it's a nationalist party, and that's why people join. After independence, the nationalism is useless, so it becomes entirely about the domestic agenda and foreign policy. So members who currently go along with some domestic issues that they don't really disagree with for the greater prize will now wish to reconsider. It could be that the party splits or that members simply join another party, as I said. The Scottish Labour and Liberal Democrats remained as a party. I imagine they would. Then they could join those. Although I don't want to compare the SNP with UKIP as well, sorry about this, but there's a similar situation potentially as well, in that with UKIP, once the Brexit referendum was won for leave, all the moderate people in UKIP left, leaving only the loonies. You can't rule out a similar exodus from the SNP to other parties after Scottish independence either. And I suppose that because the process of divorcing would take a few years, I mean, the SNP would probably have time to redefine itself in terms of a set of core beliefs that distinguishes itself from others. Time will tell. And for those who think it already does, have you read their manifesto? If you compare it to other political parties, it barely talks about anything other than the referenda. But judging by polls, I would consider it inevitable that support may switch away from the UK after Brexit. It's bobbed and weaved during the Article 50 process, not really. It's moved apart and then together again. But that could be down to the relative lows and highs of optimism about avoiding the whole show, because we don't really know what's going to happen yet. But once a decision is finally made, and if that decision is to leave, then we'll find out what Scotland really wants. And a referendum like this isn't like the Brexit referendum. The question here would be clear, and the process equally clear if even a small majority, want to leave. The statute books would need sorting out, of course. That'll take some time. But there'd be no need for much in the way of debates, I wouldn't have thought. Holyrood can easily suffice for an independent Scottish Parliament already. There'll have to be negotiations about assets and debt, but those details don't really need to be handled by Westminster or only approved. Sorting out citizenship may take a while, but there'll be up to 2 parliaments to decide how to proceed, and I can't imagine much wrangling there. Currency could be tricky. During the last Scottish referendum, the SNP said that they would continue to use the pound, but the Westminster government ruled out a currency union. So it may mean that Scotland would need its own currency, but with the intention of abandoning it in favour of the euro within a few years when it joins the EU. All a bit messy, but I'm sure solutions would be sorted out. There would be 2 fairly large implications, however, one for what's left of the UK and one for everyone. One is of travel, one is of nuclear submarines. So if the UK leaves the EU in a bafflingly insane complete break-off, then travel between the UK and the EU becomes challenging. Even an independent Scotland accepted as a member of the EU would also take a while. We may be talking a generation from now, but it would have to find more costly routes to Europe. That being said, I'd have every faith that, given the amount of time all it takes to happen, the process of divorcing, the process of applying to and joining the EU, that an isolated UK, if that's what we end up becoming, will have long since asked to come back in from the cold. So it may end up just being a speculative difficulty. Of course, just as every country trades with its closest neighbours, which is why the idea of the UK replacing EU trade with others is just madness, so too trade between England and Wales and Scotland would be badly affected in this scenario as well. But for what would remain of the UK, England and Wales, well, the nuclear submarine issue doesn't go away. We berth our Trident submarines in Scotland. Now, again, another thing that happened during the last Scottish referendum campaign, it was revealed that there is no alternative to this. Now, you and I may think that's a bit strange when England and Wales have quite a lot of coastline. But, and I'm not a mariner, so I don't understand the details, apparently it's the wrong shape. So there's literally nowhere to berth them outside of Scotland. So I guess what we'd actually have to do is to either ditch our nuclear capability, something which many people would see a lot of advantages in, or go to extra expense to geo-engineer a suitable site in England or Wales. Not sure how expensive or realistic that is. We'd need a visa to go and watch the Edinburgh Fringe, but I doubt that will be debated much either in Parliament. The price of shortbread would go up. No, I'm not really allowed to eat that anymore. I've never been a fan of salmon or whiskey. I do like Scotch eggs, however, but I can make those myself. So the remnants of the UK, of course, would be doomed. Scotland was basically the last bulwark against conservatism in Britain. Without it, they would dominate. The rest of us would be buggered. Of course, if a truly democratic process on independence were to take place, the north of England should be allowed to choose to join Scotland as well. We have closer cultural bonds with them than the south, really, if we're honest. For example, Bonnie Prince Charlie, when he marched through England, he marched through the north of England quite happily. He only ran away scared when he went into the weird south of England. York, the centre of all Western civilization, of course, looks like a small version of Scotland when you go round there. Where's my independence vote? So anyway, those are some of the implications as I see it on Brexit on the issue of Scottish independence. Let me know what you think down below, as I'm sure all the hairy Highlanders will. And I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe for further content, and click the bell notification as well. Until next time, I'll see you later.